On September 12, 2016, in spite of public opposition, Portage la Prairie City Council voted unanimously to hand over the city's wastewater treatment plant to a for-profit public-private partnership, or P3, for the next 30 years. None of the documents released publicly show any evidence that a P3 will benefit the city. The Canadian Union of Public Employees believes that P3s, which are a form of privatization, will end up costing taxpayers more than if the plant were to be publicly operated. In this video, you'll hear from Maud Barlow, the National Chairperson of the Council of Canadians and an internationally recognized expert on water. As well, you'll hear from Paul Moist, former National President of the Canadian Union of Public Employees and currently with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. And finally, you'll hear from Jim Holmes of Regina Water Watch.
Any discussion about public-private partnerships needs to be discussed and debated against the backdrop of what's happening to water globally and in Canada. One could argue if we had all the water we all thought we did once, maybe it wouldn't matter so much. But it's very important to look at this issue in terms of what's happening to water around the planet, because we are a planet running out of fresh water. Now, this was something we were all taught couldn't happen when we were back in grade 6. You remember the story about the hydrologic cycle and the water goes round and round. What our teachers didn't know and didn't teach us is that we are polluting and diverting and mismanaging that water so badly that the United Nations now says, and this is astonishing, that by 2030 the demand for water in our world will outstrip supply by 40%. That means we will only have enough water for 60% of the demand in the world, and that means that the fight for water as a human right just got harder. It's going to be much more difficult to deliver on that UN resolution that some of us have been working on so hard when you're up against depleted groundwater, rivers and lakes that have been poisoned and dammed to death, and just the lack of water in many parts of the world. And trust me, it's astounding if you just take a tour around the world. 22 countries in Africa are in crisis. The entire Middle East is going to run out of water within the next 50 years. China, half the rivers in China have disappeared since 1990. Brazil, with tons of water, is in desperate drought in the south because they cut down the Amazon and all the rain that it gave off disappeared. The United States, the Ogallala Aquifer that goes down the back spine of the U.S. Midwest will be gone in our lifetime, says the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So this notion that we have all the water to spare is not true. We are in crisis, and we need to understand that when we say, well, then who should be looking after water? How should water be managed? Now you say, aha, but we live in Canada, and Canada's different. We have 20% of the world's water. Hold on, no, we don't. We only have 20% of the world's water if we drain every river and lake. We have about 6.5% of the world's water, and most of that runs north in mighty rivers. We do not have water to spare. We have not taken care of our water. We have massive eutrophication, nutrient overload in 246 lakes across Canada, including Lake Winnipeg, including Lake Erie, very sick lakes. We allow poisons and herbicides and pesticides and chemicals to be used in our farming. We have no standards whatsoever for animal waste. We have no national drinking water standards. We have no protection for our groundwater. And the Harper government dismantled, gutted the only 3 decent water laws we had, the Fisheries Act, the Navigable Waters Protection Act, and the Canadian Environmental Assessment Act, which we're trying to get back now through consultations with the current government. So we really, we like to think that we love our water and we have so much, what I call the myth of abundance, and it's in our myths and stories and so on, but actually we take very poor care of our water, and it's time we stop doing that. Now, this is the backdrop that we have to use when we're saying, okay, should a water system be managed publicly or privately? What does it matter? Can it be either one? Well, it matters because there is a mighty contest happening around the world and here in Canada around this very question: who is going to control water? Whoever controls water is going to be both powerful and arguably very wealthy. So you have a handful of powerful private utilities, Suez, Veolia, and a number of them, a number of private bottled water companies like Nestle, which is bottling billions and billions of liters, billions every year, taking it out of the ground. You have private food companies, private farm companies, private investors investing in water. So there is a struggle between whether water is going to be privatized for profit by big corporations, by international investment, by international capital, or whether it's going to stay in control of local governments and local communities. And that matters because if we don't control it locally, we are going to lose the ability to keep it clean, to preserve it, to have decisions around who gets to make, who gets access to it. Are you going to let all the water be fracked? Are you going to let all of it be bottled and sold internationally? If that's our water, don't we have a say? This is why the discussion around P3s matter, because once you start losing control, even if it's a small part of it, like the wastewater system or the pollution treatment system, you're still opening the door for profit in water. And water is a public trust. Water is a human right. Water is life itself. We absolutely cannot allow water to be privatized, private services to come along so that people have to pay more. And study after study around the world tell us that when P3s come into a water service, the service declines, the rates go up, and people are laid off. In fact, a study from the United States last year on the 500 biggest water services, municipal water services, including New York and Los Angeles and so on, found that the water rate for drinking water was 59% higher in the P3 than the public managed, and for wastewater it was 63% higher. And 1 in 3 workers were laid off when water was privatized under a P3. Since the year 2000, 235 municipalities have gone back from trying privatization and said that was a mistake, gone back to a public system. Paris is one of the more recent ones. After a decade of private delivery, they were able to lower the rate of water to their customers within a year and build a nice sustainability fund. Because why? There's no profit. All the money that's being spent on water services is being spent on water services, not to pay investors. So please understand that this isn't a small little debate happening in a small community or a big community around something that's esoteric. This is life and death itself. We have to have a new water ethic where we say everything we do with water, the way we grow food, the way we produce energy, the way we trade across borders, has to protect water, and we have to keep it in the public realm. We owe this to the next generation who have the same right to breathe clean air and drink clean water that we do. Thank you so much.
Good evening. My name is Paul Moist. I'm representing tonight the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Firstly, let me thank each and every one of you for showing up tonight with all the weather challenges, and offer my apologies for not being present tonight, but I'm happy to be able to tape this message to go along with a PowerPoint presentation, which I'll dive into right away. First of all debates regarding public-private partnerships are about a few things, and they're definitely not about some other things. They are about public control over public assets. They are about what's the best deal for the taxpayers, the citizens whom we serve. And lastly, they're about accountability and transparency. What they're not about is who builds new infrastructure. Typically, for the last number of decades in the public sector in Canada, the private sector builds new infrastructure, like a hospital, major construction projects, like a school, or like a wastewater treatment plant. The ownership and operation of those facilities is the contested terrain, but who builds this stuff? The traditional partnership is not up for debate, and I certainly won't debate that tonight. This work belongs in the private sector's hands, and they've done a good job for Canada historically. And P3 debates should not be about rigid ideological positions. It should be about transparency, openness, and what's the best use of public funds for public projects. A couple of examples I want to share with you that are not exactly the same as what you face here in Portage la Prairie, but they speak to these principles that I talk about. One is financing of P3s and a small project, the Charleswood Bridge project in Winnipeg. Small by infrastructure standards, a $10 million bridge, a P3 arrangement, spreading leaseback arrangements over 30 years. It was a first for Winnipeg in the mid-1990s. Such smaller capital projects typically would be spread over 20 years, not 30. Each of you here tonight understands what the cost of money is if you take a mortgage over 40 years or 30 years or 20 years. Same principle applies to arranging for money to pay for a bridge. The private borrowing rate in 1995 was 11.05%. It exceeded the city's rates by 2%. The city paid 9.5% in 1994. So over 30 years, under the P3 arrangement, about $40.2 million will be paid, because it's still ongoing, because the rate's locked in, versus $22.4 million total cost had the city proceeded in the conventional manner of putting out a tender for design and build, but financing it and paying it off over a 20-year period. So this has been a wonderful bridge, well built, well constructed, but a very expensive piece of infrastructure because of the P3 financing arrangement. And to conclude on the Charleswood Bridge, and the numbers I'm giving you are taken out of this book by Professor John Loxley from the University of Manitoba. The drop in interest rates since the mid-1990s has been a windfall for the private consortium with the Charleswood Bridge. The city continues to make lease payments based on 11.05%, but that's not what the private borrowing cost is today, and they no doubt would have renegotiated their borrowing cost, and that all accrues to them. The Charleswood Bridge is the only, at this point in time, was the only civic asset to have a maintenance guarantee, and it was a very expensive P3 decision for the city of Winnipeg. Another P3 issue is public control over public assets. And the example I want to use is the Hamilton-Wentworth water and sewage system. In 1994, Hamilton-Wentworth, the city of Hamilton and the region around Hamilton, entered into a $180 million contract with Phillips Utilities Management to operate, maintain, and manage the region's water and sewage system, an unsolicited proposal by this private entity. In 1999, PUMC, the private corporation, was sold to another corporation, an offshoot of Enron called Azurix. In 2001, Azurix was sold to American Water Works. And American Water Works was taken over by a German-based firm, RWE, in late 2001. 4 separate private operators in a 5-year period. The issues that we now know from studying Hamilton-Wentworth are as follows. The contract contained financial incentives for cost savings. The regional government retained responsibility for capital upgrades and maintenance over $10,000. So a lot of responsibility financially remained with the public realm. In January 1996, a major spill with 180 million liters of raw sewage spilling into Hamilton Harbor, 115 homes and businesses were flooded. A huge failing in the area of accountability. There was no requirement in this contract for reporting on a monthly or even quarterly basis, no public consultation, and the contractor actually cut staff by 50% and received an incentive payment for that efficiency, which didn't serve the region very well when problems arose. In 2004, the regional government voted to end the failed P3 experiment, and all the work was brought back in-house where it resides today, well documented by Professor Loxley in his 2010 book. A third issue, disclosure and transparency, very relevant to the P3 we're talking about tonight in your community. And the Ontario Auditor General in December 2014 issued a scathing report on 74 so-called public-private partnerships in Ontario where $8 billion more was spent than if these projects had been publicly financed, than if the province had borrowed money at rates they could pay. There was little competition, and internal costs, according to the Auditor General, were exaggerated. Here's a quote from the Ontario Auditor General's report, Bonnie Lysak. In our discussions with the external advisors, they confirm that the probabilities and cost impacts are not based on any empirical data supplied that supports the valuation of the risks, but rather on their professional judgment and experience, close quote. So the so-called risk transfers in these P3s, according to the accounting firms, that's a big feature of what we're going to hear about tonight with the P3 in this community. These in Ontario were not based on any empirical data. They don't appear to be here in Portage la Prairie. They are a valuation of risk based on the professional judgment of stakeholders such as major accounting firms. So to conclude on disclosure and transparency, here's a quote from a colleague from the CCPA in 2006. The major accounting firms now make so much money on P3 projects, it seems unlikely they would ever speak against them. And there are a few examples, including the national accounting firm speaking here tonight, involved with this one. And here's a quote from a CEO of Partnerships BC, a P3 entity in British Columbia. Public sector comparators won't do you much good anyways, because I can make them, the public sector, as bad as we want to in order to make the private sector look good. Mr. Larry Blaine, President and CEO of Partnerships BC. So disclosure and transparency, this slide shows us a guide for municipalities in considering P3s that CUPE has shared with municipal governments all across Canada, including this government here in Portage la Prairie. They document secrecy with P3s. Winnipeg's Disraeli Bridge project, we asked for a breakdown of the risk transfer that made that case such a good P3 in the eyes of the city. Our Freedom of Information request to justify this argument was denied. Here in Portage la Prairie, we requested through Freedom of Information, CUPE did, a breakdown of the risk transference. All the yellow pages marked on these 1,500 pages, dozens and dozens of pages redacted. All of the numbers associated with justifying risk transference are privileged information. So commercial interests are privileged, public interest is sacrificed, and we don't accept that and never will. Let me wrap up with the bottom line. Public interest issues including financing, public control, and transparency point to serious questions regarding P3s. 98% of Canada's infrastructure assets owned by provinces and municipalities are in the public realm. Portage la Prairie is really going against the grain of what goes on in Canada with infrastructure with this decision they've made. And a quote from just the Free Press just a week ago. Municipalities need more money for infrastructure, but in many instances are not rushing into P3s because they cost much more in the long run than direct borrowing. I want to end tonight with some questions for the Portage la Prairie P3. And maybe we need more public meetings like this to get answers to these. The August 26th Ernst & Young summary P3 business case contains no numbers and is of little use. The preliminary value for money chart on page 9 contains no data to support the alleged P3 savings. Where are the numbers? And why are all of the numbers redacted in the information that CUPE requested? Number 2, the administration's April 2016 report to the Wastewater Committee outlines nominal payments of $400 million over 30 years for this $106 million project. The report states $124 million of risk is transferred to the private operator, and it goes on to say, quote, the values assigned to each risk are subjective and difficult to evaluate, close quote. The above explanation is not acceptable. The public has a right to know how these figures were arrived at, or were they plopped out of midair? We have no justification for this risk transference number. 3, the April 11, 2016 admin report states that a designed DBB would count against the city's debt limits whereas proceeding with a P3 via a design, build, finance, operate, management, P3, will be seen as a lease payment. Auditor Generals across Canada, including the City Auditor General in Winnipeg on the Charleswood Bridge, have rejected this. These lease payments will be counted as debt charges. 4, the existing Portage P3 treatment plant upgrades from 1995-96, the expansion of the bulk volume fermentor, has experienced problems as outlined at the public meeting, September council meeting. Will the city consider an independent operational review of this existing P3 prior to proceeding with the newly proposed P3 arrangement? And last question, the city chose to access PPP Canada funding, which required adoption of a P3 approach. It's the only way you can get the money from that account. Since this decision, the new Trudeau government has eliminated mandatory P3 screens for projects exceeding $100 million. They've also announced enhanced funding under the Building Canada Fund, where you're not required to go P3. You can, but you're not required to. Has City Council requested that federal funding from the revamped Building Canada Fund be made available to replace PPP Canada funding so that the City of Portage la Prairie could actually access federal money without having to go the P3 route? Thank you again for your attendance tonight. My apologies for not being here. I hope you have a vigorous debate. The community should debate this issue. Thank you very much.
My name is Jim Holmes, and I was part of the committee Regina Water Watch, which led a campaign in Regina to try and keep Regina's wastewater treatment plant public. I understand now the people of Portage are faced with upgrading their wastewater treatment plant, and that Regina is being touted as a model that they should follow. I think that's a very bad idea, and I'd like to try to tell you why. I'll be talking mostly from documents that were produced by the City of Regina or by its consultant Deloitte. A little bit of background. Regina needs the new wastewater treatment plant. It has to be operating by January 1st, 2017 to meet the federal requirements. Regina ended up applying for a public-private partnership grant from the federal government. They did that because that was the only way they could get 25% of the funding from the federal government. Regina discharges its sewage into Wascana Creek, which flows into the Qu'Appelle River, which eventually flows into the Assiniboine River, which then, of course, flows down through Portage. The good news that Regina probably told you is that their plan is on schedule, and it came in with significant savings. The bad news is that neither of those statements are in fact true. The plant, when they started looking at it, the initial plant said if they did it in the traditional fashion, it could be done as early as July 2016, a good 6 months ahead of the required time frame. When they went to a P3, the time frame slipped. Construction would start much later. They might meet the regulatory requirements by January 1st, 2017, but the plant itself, construction won't be complete until March of 2017, so a full 9 months later than the traditional method. In fact, construction started much later, about 4 months later than they expected. They're still saying it's going to be on time and they'll meet regulatory requirements. That's a month away, we'll see, but they say they're on schedule. So first one was it would have been done much sooner had they gone through the traditional method. The second thing they're saying is that the plant came in much under the estimated cost. That at $181 million, they say they saved about $43.5 million on the cost. The problem is there are lots of estimates on that plant. When it was going to be done in traditional fashion, the estimate was $153 million with a 20% cushion in there, taking up to about $183 million. The next one came out 6 months later after they decided to go with the P3. They took that top figure of $183 million, added another 15% on to take it up to $207. And then very quickly after that, Deloitte came in and did their estimate and added another 15% on that, taking it up to $224 million. The cost at this point had gone up by almost 45%. So that's the savings. The savings they're getting is they're not paying the inflated 45% cost. They're right back where they started from at about $181 million for the plant. There is no savings, despite what Deloitte and the city have claimed. Now, there are two things that come into the equation of whether you want to go with a public-private partnership or not. It's universally acknowledged that a city can borrow money much cheaper than any private entity. How much cheaper is a bit of such a debate. The general consensus is private costs are about 2% higher. That's the figure that we used when we were making our argument on the plant. It's the figure that the conference board, which is in favor of P3, uses. It's the figure that Saskatchewan Builds, which promotes P3s for the provincial government, uses. Strangely, our mayor, without ever providing any documentation, said that the cost would be probably around 1.5%, but certainly no more than 1%. And he repeated that 3 times in public debates in the city. Now we actually know what the cost is. The city signed a borrowing bylaw to borrow the money for the new plant. Now that the contract has been awarded, it's in fact 2.46% higher. Much higher than the norm, probably much higher than any other P3 that I know of. The city of Regina really got hosed on that case. The important thing about the interest costs is just like a mortgage. These costs stay with you, and the payment schedule is over 30 years, so it adds up. What the P3 advocates say is, oh yes, you'll pay more interest, but we are so much more efficient than the public sector that you'll save money on the project. The only difficulty is there is absolutely no evidence that there are any efficiencies, certainly not sufficient to outweigh the interest costs. In 2011, an all-party committee of the British House of Commons came to that conclusion. That simply there were no savings to be had in that model. More interesting and more recently, in 2014, the Auditor General of Ontario looked at all 75 projects over the last 10 years in Ontario, said that there were no savings in the P3 model. It probably cost Ontario an extra $8 billion over that time period. And having come to that conclusion, she went to the P3 advocates for a rebuttal. Their response was that there was no empirical evidence that there were any savings in their P3 model. They just knew that. That was their anecdotal evidence. That was their professional opinion, but they had no evidence to back it up. Interestingly, the next day, the Globe and Mail phoned Mark Romoff, the head of the Council for Public-Private Partnerships, which is a lobby group pushing P3s, and asked him. And what he said was, if we collected information, it would show that the public sector was always more expensive. But the important thing is, they don't have any of that information. And what you had to say was, they simply knew it was more and more expensive intuitively. So in Regina, we were talking about $181 million. I think Portage is talking someplace in the neighborhood of $200 million. And what they're asking us to do is to spend this money based on their intuition, based on their gut feeling. So that's the problem. There is no evidence to support that. They're not quicker. The Calgary Board of Education man to that was begging to be let off the hook, saying that it always takes longer to do the P3 ones, and certainly we saw that evidence in Regina. The interest costs are crushing. When you're building anything, it doesn't make sense to pay more interest. It does make sense to buy quality, but there is absolutely zero evidence that you'll get any better quality with the P3 model. So again, based on the Regina experience, based on the Ontario experience, based on the British experience, we would suggest that Portage stay as far away from the P3 model as they can. Thanks.